when I woke up, very confused. She said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an IRONCLAD original. Welcome to On the X. My guest today is Daniel Pink, a 5-time New York Times bestselling author and one of the leading modern voices on business, psychology, and human behavior. He's written several books, including Drive, To Sell Is Human, When, and A Whole New Mind, each one digging into what really motivates us, how we make decisions, and what it takes to thrive in a rapidly changing world. His most recent work, The Power of Regret, challenges the idea that we should live with no regrets. Instead, Pink reveals how regret, when understood and harnessed, can be one of our most powerful tools for growth, clarity, and change. Before becoming a full-time writer, he worked in politics and economic policy, including serving as chief speechwriter for Vice President Al Gore. Today, his TED Talks have been viewed tens of millions of times, and his books are used by educators, business leaders, and high performers worldwide. So here we go with Daniel Pink on the X. So let's just start off with, like, where did this idea come from? What made you, did you have some big regret in your life that made you want to do this, or was it something else?
I had a lot of regrets in my life, and that was one of the catalysts for writing this book. I mean, if there was a single catalyst, it was that was attending my elder daughter's college graduation a few years ago, and which is kind of for parents, for any of us, it's a kind of a marker in time, and it just sort of blew my mind, because I felt like this kid was just born and suddenly she's graduated from college. And I also felt like I myself had just graduated from college. If you were to wake me up in the middle of the night and ask me how old I was, I would say I'm like at 28, 29, and so it just seemed like an error. And so anyway, so I was sort of like wigged out by that, and started thinking about my own college experience and some of my regrets from that experience. Even though I like college, generally like college. And when I came back to talk to people about it, I did it very sheepishly because I knew that nobody wanted to talk about regrets. And I discovered pretty quickly that everybody wanted to talk about it. That as soon as I mentioned some of my regrets, it gave people kind of the license to open up and talk about their regrets. And for a writer, that's a pretty good sign that when people are engaging in that way. And so that was really, if there's a single catalyst. The other thing is, it's also, there's a time of life thing here. There's no way on God's green earth I would have written a book about regret in my 30s. I didn't have enough mileage on me. But in my 50s, I had enough mileage on me, and it seemed kind of inevitable. I mean, I knew that, I likely had more of my life behind me than ahead of me at that point, which is kind of existentially terrifying. And so,
yeah, I know. I feel that same way too these days.
And so you start thinking about life, your own life, the world, in somewhat different ways. And so, so I was really intrigued by this emotion and what it taught us. And, I thought I had some interesting ways to get at new answers to what it was all about.
Yeah. It's funny you talk about your kid, graduating from college. I'm in the same boat, but with high school. So my oldest is about to go off to college from high school.
That's another moment.
And but it's one of the things I was thinking as I was reading this book is you sort of start every single chapter with, and I want to have you offer some details on this, but like this world regret survey where people kind of say things they regret. And you kind of have these, almost the way a lot of books will have a quote from a famous person at the beginning of the chapter. You've got these little quotes from just everyday people.
This is what
I regret. This is what I regret.
Exactly.
And it made me reflect on how much shit in my own life I regret. I was like, there was a couple emotions that I got out of that, I suppose, or ways that I thought about it. One was, there's a ton of stuff I regret. Now, I don't dwell on almost any of it at this point, but tons of things that I go, I wish I'd done that differently. But the other one was, it made me actually feel pretty good. Like, wow, all these people out there regret the same kind of things. Like, everybody regrets a lot of stuff. And it was sort of like, made me feel good. I think sometimes we think in our own bubble, like, oh, I fucked so much stuff up in my life and nobody else did that. And it's like not true at all. So, and the point on the high school thing is, the current one that sort of has weighed on my mind recently is this. I think you would classify it as a connection regret, is like time with family, which is a big one, where it's like, did I spend enough time with this kid growing up, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I like to think that I'm a good parent, but it's always like, could I have done more type of thing, that idea. So talk about where you kind of got all this data, this world regret survey, and how that came about.
Yeah. So this book rests on, as you know, Chris, from sort of three legs on the stool here. One of them is looking at some of the existing research in social psychology and economics, in cognitive science and neuroscience about this emotion of regret. There's actually a fair amount out there. And it had some very interesting things to say, one of which affirms exactly what you're saying, which is that everybody has regrets. It's one of the most universal emotions that human beings have. It's one of the most common emotions that human beings have. If you don't have regrets, you likely have some kind of neurodegenerative disease, or you're a sociopath. I mean, truly, it's that common.
Yeah, you talk about that a little bit. It was like Huntington's disease, right? Or something else. Where
certain kinds of neurodegenerative disorders like Huntington's disease, certain kinds of Parkinson's disease will interfere with the brain's ability to do counterfactual thinking, which is what underlies regret. Little tiny kids like 5-year-olds, 4-year-olds don't have regrets because their brains haven't developed enough. Sociopaths don't have regret, but everyone else does. And I think that, that tells us something. It says that regret is there for a reason. It's functional. And again, to one of your earlier points, it's that it's part of what it is to be human. And so the real question is, what do we do with it? And so a lot of us just ignore it, pretend it doesn't exist. That's a bad idea. Some of us wallow in it. That's a worse idea. But what we should be doing is just listening to it, confronting it, using it as information. When we do that, it can be a transformative emotion. So anyway, back to the stool. One leg was existing research. A second leg was a quantitative survey, a public opinion survey I did of American attitudes about regret, trying to get at demographic differences, of which there were not many, it turns out. And then finally, I think the thing that was really helped me get some breakthrough in understanding this was this World Regret Survey, which was just a giant information collection tool where I invited people around the world to submit their largest regret. And we now have a database of 26,000 regrets from people in 134 countries. And that's where a lot of the quotes that you're talking about, that's where all the quotes that you're talking about came from. And you just see, like, if you were to sort of conceal where the quotes come from, you would have no idea. Is that from somebody in Kentucky? Is that from somebody in Oregon? Is that from somebody in Malaysia? I mean, that's how universal these things are.
With that being said, just because before we get into kind of the buckets of types of regrets that you kind of lay out in this, were there cultural differences though? Are there things that parts of the world people regret more and more than other places?
It's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have an excellent answer to that, in part because the international survey, the international data collection that we did was all qualitative. I don't have, like, it wasn't a random sample of people. And in the sample of the World Regret Survey, out of the 26,000, we had a lot in North America, we had a lot in Europe, we had a large number in places like Australia and India. We had less though on the entire continent of Africa, and we had less on, even though we had the survey up in Mandarin, we didn't have a huge number in China, although we had a fair number. So it wasn't. So I'm loath to say that. The one, my hunch, and it's just a hunch, is that the cultural differences were not massive, except in one regard, and that is when you look at certain kinds of moral regrets. Yes, you have a lot of the moral regrets that people have to do with essentially with harming other people. So I bullied somebody when I was younger, and I've regretted it ever since. Or I cheated on my spouse, and I've regretted it ever since. So you're basically harming somebody else. Yep. That was universal. You did see a sprinkling of regrets from Asia that are the kind of regrets that you probably wouldn't see very much of in the United States. Things about, I didn't honor my parents enough. I wasn't respectful to my uncle. Those kinds of things about respect and authority, particularly within family relations, that are a much bigger deal in, say, East Asia than they are in North America, which is more kind of, individualistic. So I think there were some things there. But beyond that, really, I don't think that the cultural differences are massive. In the same way, I'm much more secure in my position. The demographic differences in the U.S., men versus women, people who are white versus people who aren't white, people with lots of formal education with people who are less formal education, even things like introversion and I tested. Do introverts have different regrets than extroverts? Nope. Do people who believe in God have different regrets than people who don't believe in God? Nope. Do people with large amounts of formal education have different regrets than people with less formal education? A tiny little bit, but not that much, So there weren't massive demographic differences internally. So that makes me think that there aren't massive ones externally, except for that one dimension, which has to do with cultural values of, family respect and authority and that.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
And you mentioned in there, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And I'm glad, not to get on a sidebar, but I'm glad you brought that up, because I loved that book. And I think I've read I haven't read his most recent book, but I just think it's such an underrepresented book in his catalog that everybody should read. I just think it's so, especially today.
I am your hallelujah chorus for that, man. I think that the righteous mind is, to me, it is one of the books that changed the way I think about the world more profoundly than almost anything else.
Yep.
Both on the dimension that when we make moral decisions, we don't rationally weigh the pluses and minuses, the pros or cons. What we do is we have an instinctive, visceral response, and we use reason. We use reason to justify the instinctive response.
Yes.
That reason is not a judge kind of soberly weighing the facts. Reason is essentially an advocate. Reason is a press secretary, for a particular emotional reaction. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that I think it gives you greater dimensionality of it. I think it's very helpful. Honestly, I mean, just sort of putting a very fine point on it, I think it's a very helpful book for left of center Americans who live in big cities.
Yes, totally.
To put it mildly, as a left of center American who lives in a big city, I can say that.
Yes.
Because what it shows is that people's morality is actually basically the conservative political morality is actually has a greater breadth than the liberal American political morality. And one isn't better than the other. They're just different. They're just different kinds of moral foundations. And so this goes to a little bit to this idea of, things like purity, dignity, respect, and so forth, which are much higher order moral principles with some people more associated with the political right than people associated with the political left.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, not to get off on that tangent, but I was as I was reading through, I was like, oh.
If we can get some of your listeners to pick up that book and read it, we have done a good deed for America.
I completely agree with you on that. So just last thing on the survey, like how'd they do that? Like, did they just send out like it's something in the mail? Like, hey, can you write down your regrets? Like how?
Well, okay. So for the forgive me for getting in the weeds. For the quantitative survey, we did it like you would do a political poll.
Okay.
Where there are I worked with a data analytics company, a survey research company, and because of these panels, just in the same way there are panels of voters out there, there are panels of representative people out there. So it's expensive. We got a panel of 4,500 people. I mean, it's not like a single setting, but multiple days of doing this. But a panel of a representative sample, we surveyed something like 4,400 people because I wanted to make sure that we could look for demographic differences. And so, if you want to say, do women without a college degree have different regrets than somebody else? You have to have a large sample of women without a college degree. So that's how we did the quantitative one. The World Regret Survey, I just put out the word and people started submitting it online.
Were they anonymous? Because a lot of this stuff is personal. Like you're talking about, like adultery and like beating people up, and I mean, it's like this is personal stuff.
Heck yeah! So that's such an interesting point that you made there. So let me give you the answer to that. So so was it anonymous? Yes. Everything was anonymous. However, I gave people the option of including their email address when they submitted it. So what I wanted from people when they submitted their regret in the World Regret Survey, I wanted their age, I wanted their gender, I wanted their location, I wanted their regret. All right. I also gave them the option of including their email address if they were willing to be contacted for a follow-up interview.
Okay.
But not every, you didn't have to, that was not a condition of it at all. It was totally 100% optional. And to my surprise, about a third of people offered up their email address to be contacted for a follow-up interview, which is kind of amazing because it's like, oh, yeah, I want to tell my regret to a complete stranger.
Yeah.
That's kind of weird in itself. And then saying, yes, and I want to talk to this stranger about it a little bit more. I want to give him my email address so I can talk to, and I did, 150 or so follow-up interviews with people who had submitted their email address so I could get a little bit more texture behind the stories. But I think that for a lot of people, to your point, Chris, this was operating like a little bit of a kind of an online confessional.
It's funny. It strikes me as that, right? And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but you even talk in the end of the book how one of the ways to work through this is to talk it out, right? To sort of, take it out of your head and make it verbal or write it down or whatever is a catharsis, obviously, that helps you process it. I mean,
it's also why, most religions of the world have rituals for dealing with people's regret. I mean, we mentioned, it's the confession booth. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. And you confess your sins. And then the priest says, say 4 Hail Marys and everything's going to be good. Or you have, in Judaism, there's an entire day. So the most solemn holiday in the Jewish calendar of Yom Kippur, where it's devoted to atoning for your sins and where you confess your sins to God and you don't eat as kind of expiation for those, So I think what's interesting is that religious traditions have ways to deal with this emotion, where secular world does not. And I think that's one reason why a lot of people are stuck. They don't have the mechanisms, tools, the rituals, the community to process that regret.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't even thought about that, but yeah, that absolutely makes sense. So let's talk about the sort of 4 buckets, so to speak, the 4 categories, because this is another concept I had never even considered. Like, okay, if I'm going to put my regrets into columns, what would those be? But you have 4 of them: foundation, boldness, moral, and connection regrets. So break that down for people.
Yeah. So that's not a categorization that existed. That's a categorization that I discovered in looking through these regrets.
Yeah. Right.
Because I was trying to the way that scholars have traditionally categorized regret is by the domain of life. So it's like, this is a career regret. This is a health regret. This is a family regret. And I tried categorizing them that way, and it wasn't making a lot of sense to me. I did that in the quantitative version of the survey, where I had people organize their regret into those kinds of, education, family, health, whatever. And I wasn't getting a lot of insight. Then the great thing about the volume of these regrets is that when you start reading them through, you start seeing there was no AI involved in here. There was, it's like it's just me reading them through. You start to see things. And what I started doing was, because I'm somewhat anal-retentive, is like printing them out. And then there's a table right here. Yeah. And I would take the printouts and put them on the table. And I would start almost like sorting them to see like what they had in common. And I started noticing these kinds of patterns that there were 4 things, as you said, that kept coming up. So let me quickly go through this. So one of them are foundation regrets. Foundation regrets are small decisions early that accumulate to terrible consequences later on. So it's things like, I didn't study hard enough in school and now I don't have any skills. I didn't exercise or eat right and now I'm profoundly unhealthy. I spent too much and saved too little and now I'm broke.
Yep.
So so that's foundation regrets. If only I'd done the work. Boldness regrets, a very big category, and this is where I think that the domain doesn't get at what's really going on here. So boldness regrets are people looking back on their lives, as regret is retrospective. They look back on their lives, they remember they were at a juncture and they had a choice: play it safe or take the chance. And overwhelmingly, when people don't take the chance, they regret it. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. They regret not taking the chance. And it doesn't matter whether it's, I could have gone on this great trip, but I was too chicken to do it. and now I regret it. I could have. I have huge numbers of people who wanted to ask somebody out on a date years ago.
The guy on the train, the Bruce, that dude, that was heartbreaking. Like,
I know,
that's
very real. It's like this, but that's a great example of it. This guy who 40 years after riding on a train with a beautiful woman, he was going to get off the train with her. And he didn't. And 40 years later, he still regrets it. So a lot of regrets about dating, basically asking somebody out on a date, making a move. A lot of regrets about speaking up for something that you believe in. A lot of regrets about not starting businesses. So boldness regrets are, if only I'd taken the chance.
Mm-hmm.
Big category. Moral regrets, which we've sort of flicked at a little bit, are if only I'd done the right thing. So once again, you're at a juncture. You can do the right thing. You can do the wrong thing. Overwhelmingly, when people do the wrong thing, they regret it, because most of us are not sociopaths. Most of us are good people, and most of us want to be good people, and most of us feel shitty when we're not good people. And so that's moral regrets. And then connection regrets are about reaching out to connections. So you have a relationship that was intact or should have been intact. It comes apart, often just very slowly. Somebody wants to reach out, they don't, then ultimately they regret it. So you have foundation, if only I'd done the work; boldness, if only I'd taken the chance; moral, if only I'd done the right thing; and connection, if only I'd reached out.
Yep. And was there like percentages of the, you know what I mean? Like if you looked at those across the 26,000
I can look at those. I can look at those in percentages. I think we want you to take it with a grain of salt because it wasn't a random sample. Mm-hmm. But the biggest category are connection. Second biggest category, pretty close behind, is boldness. Third category, even further behind, is foundation, and the smallest one is moral.
Okay.
So, but it's really connection and boldness. Connection and boldness represented well over half.
Yeah.
Of the thing. So, and that's that's consistent with a lot of the existing research, which is that, and this is true in my quantitative survey as well. It's totally clear to me that people regret inactions more than actions.
I was just going to ask this, right? Like, because that's the other way I think of it, is like an action regret versus an I was going to say
exactly
the exact term of, I wish I hadn't done this versus I wish I had done this, right?
This one's not even close. Remember, I said in the quantitative survey, this big public opinion poll that I did, there were not very many demographic differences.
Yeah,
there was one, and it had to do with age, and this is like powerful. It basically had a very little demographic difference, very few, very, very few. I was really surprised by this. Very few demographic differences, and then one monster one. And the monster one was age. So people in their 20s tended to have equal numbers of regrets of action and inaction. People in their 30s had more inaction regrets than action regrets. People in their 40s, a lot more inaction regrets than action regrets. People in their 50s, way more inaction. People in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 4 times the number of so it seems very clear to me. Over time, the regrets that will stick with you are what you didn't do. And those tend to be boldness and connection regrets. I didn't tell somebody that I love them. I didn't reach out to my friend and now he's passed away. I didn't speak up for something that mattered to me. I didn't ask that person out on a date. I didn't start that business. I didn't shoot my shot. That's what's so clear to me. That's what sticks with us and gnaws at us essentially forever.
Yeah, and that to me seems almost intuitive. Every time I hear about a deathbed regret, it is, I wish I had done blah blah blah, right? Or it's that it's some inaction of some sort. So
because here's the thing, like certain kinds of actions, there's a reason for that. Like certain kinds of actions, let's say I have a lot of people who have regrets about bullying other people when they were much younger. Mm-hmm. Well, if you bully somebody when you're younger, and I have people who did this, they go back, they find the person who they bullied 30 years ago, they track them down, and they apologize. You know, I've had many people do that. I've had many people who are on the receiving end of bullying who got those things via like a Facebook message from this guy who I hated when I was in junior high, and suddenly he's saying it's like he bullied me for 2 weeks in middle school, and it's bothered him for 30 years, and now he's trying to make amends for it. You know, so if you hurt somebody, you can make amends, you know, and even if you make bad decisions, like we see a lot in the qualitative survey, the World Regret Survey, we had a lot of people regret bad marriages. There's no question about that. And what often that they do is they find a silver lining in it. So, and they make peace with it. So, you know, I shouldn't have married that idiot, but at least I have these 2 great kids. So they find, you know, a positive in it. But with inaction regrets, you can't do that.
Can't do it. Right. Yeah.
So it sticks.
Yeah.
And it ends up, so not only can you not do it, but it ends up being in domains, boldness and connection, that are really important to people's sense of well-being.
The bully thing is funny because reading through and the number of bully quotes that were in there, I had 2 thoughts. One was, wow, there's a lot more bullies out there than I thought there were. That's like, but then the other one is, I think some of us sort of think, well, it's like once a bully, always a bully. Like they just grew up to be an asshole. And it's probably not the case almost ever. It's like that person grew up and went, yeah, I shouldn't have done that, you know, and feels bad about it.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that interesting? I mean, there's one woman who, I wrote about her in the book. She was one of those people who she filled out the survey. She gave her email address. I read her regret. It was very interesting. I contacted her. I did a follow-up interview. So the long story short is that this is a woman. She lived in Kansas. She bullied somebody, a girl, when she was like 9 or 10 years old. And I'm on the phone with her or on Zoom with her interviewing her about this thing that happened 40 years ago. She's 50. She's in tears because it still bothers her 40 years later. Yeah. So it's like, to your point, it's like
wild.
Yeah. The other thing that surprised me about the bullying was how international it was. That is, somehow I always associated bullying as like an American thing.
Yeah, I guess I did too. Yeah.
You know, like, but it was international and internationally tormenting to people.
On the X is brought to you by Mechanics Wear. Mechanics Wear gloves are kind of the go-to glove, I think, for most people out there, whether it's working around the house or on the job or some kind of tactical setting. That's certainly been the case for me throughout my life. And they've made a whole bunch of improvements to the gloves that they have out there. So they've got the kind of original series here with the Velcro backing, Velcro close that most people can use in sort of everyday settings, very ubiquitous for various things that you might want to do. Then they've got these fast fit ones, which you essentially just slide on. There's a little loop there around the wrist where you can pull them on. And then they've got the Impact series, which has a reinforced backing to protect your knuckles. And then they've got this lock ring reinforcement around the thumb now, where there's a lot of wear and tear. There's a whole bunch of other improvements to these. And if you go to their website, they literally have a 5 to 7 minute video about each one of these sets of gloves and all the improvements they've made, from the material, reducing the seams, making them more reinforced, making them more moisture wicking. It's clear that they put a lot of care and attention into their gloves. And if you listen to the guy talk on the website, they really love gloves. And I think that comes out in everything they do. When I'm going out to a hardware store and I'm looking for some gloves, I almost look at everything else as just kind of a cheap knockoff. So definitely my go-to glove, highly recommended. Mechanics Wear gloves, they're available at most retailers on mechanicswear.com and GSA Advantage, and they're proud to offer an exclusive 15% off discount through the ID.me program to military veterans and first responders. So check them out. So let's talk about, so what do we do about this, right? I mean, the whole premise of your book is kind of, we don't necessarily do this, right? And you sort of start off with this, a lot of these stories of this motto of no regrets and people tattooing it on themselves. By the way, if you're out there, don't get a no regret tattoo. It's after reading this too, it's like the most unoriginal tattoo you can possibly get. But beyond that, like, let's start with what are we doing wrong when it comes to our relationship with regrets and how we deal with them, I guess.
We are evaluating them because it's negative, because it feels bad. Our response to our negative emotion generally goes in two different directions, both of which are mistakes. So the one is like basically saying, oh, you know what? I'm feeling regret, but ignore it, because the way to have a good life is to be positive, not negative, to look forward, not back. So I'm just going to ignore this negative feeling that I have, that I'm feeling bad about something for 30 years. I'm just going to ignore that. Okay. Bad idea. Right. But what's also a bad idea, I mean, I just want to be very clear about this. What's an equally bad idea, if not a worse idea, is to wallow in it, is to stew on it, is to say, oh my God, I bullied somebody 30 years ago. I'm the worst person in the world. I'm horrible. That's a really bad idea. That does not help you out. What you should be doing is a third way, which is thinking about your regret, using it as a piece of data, using it as a notification, using it as a signal. And when we do that, and we do that in a systematic way, regret can actually make us better. We can actually lead a better life than we were leading before. And the way to do that, as you suggested earlier, well, the first way to do that, which I think is really important, is to treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. So that, like, a lot of times when we have regrets, or even when we experience a failure or a setback more broadly, we talk to ourselves in ways that are ridiculous. They're brutal. They're cruel. Yeah. And like, we would never talk that way to somebody else, and yet we're willing to talk that way to ourselves. I mean, listen, I'm guilty. I have been guilty of this. My self-talk, say, you asshole, what's wrong with you? And I would very rarely say that to somebody else, And so what the research says is, don't do that. Treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Don't treat yourself better than anybody else, but there's no advantage in treating yourself worse than anybody else. And there's a tendency to think, as you were saying at the top of the show, Chris, that when someone has a regret, it's like you feel singular. It's like, oh, I must be the only one. I'm such a loser. And you're not. It's like any regret that any of your listeners has, I can find in 38 seconds in the database. I mean, it's like, you're really not that special. Yeah. And so treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Recognize as a part of the human condition. Second part is to write about it or talk about it. This is why, as we were talking about a moment ago, religious traditions have ways to talk about it, because when we talk about it, we relieve some of the burden off of our shoulders, but we also it helps make sense of our regrets when we talk about it or write about it. And then finally, the other important thing here is to take a step back and like really use it as evidence, as data, as information, like be very analytical about it and saying, okay, what is this? What's the lesson here? What's the lesson here? The lesson, let's go with the bullying example. The lesson here for the people, for this woman, Kim, who broke into tears for something she did 40 years ago. What's the lesson here? The lesson is that you, Kim, value kindness. You value kindness probably more than you might realize, but for this regret. And therefore, you're going to be better off in the rest of your life if you make an extra effort to treat people with kindness. And so, or if you have a regret about, not speaking up at a previous job and it bothers you 10 years later, it's saying to you, like, you value honesty, you value taking a stand against things that aren't right. And so that's an important value to you. So the next time you're in that situation, speak up, like to avoid feeling that regret in the future. And so when we, forgive ourselves, treat ourselves with compassion, when we write about the regret, talk about the regret to make sense of it, and then when we extract a lesson to guide us in the future, this is a very useful emotion. That's why it's there. That's why it's in our brain.
So sticking on that particular adjective there is part of the problem that we tend to group emotions into buckets of positive and negative. I think about this a lot these days because I hear that all over the place. And I just don't think it's right. It's like, there's no such thing as a negative emotion or a positive emotion. Like every emotion has a utility. Like we have it for a reason so that we process our experience appropriately. And the problem is that we have maladapted relationships with those to those reactions, right? In terms of our responses. But I often think that part of the problem is you feel something like regret, and it's like that's tied to negativity, or you feel sadness and that's tied to negativity. And that's what creates some of the resistance to it.
I think you're exactly right. I actually wrestle with this in the writing of it, about identifying it as a negative, calling it a negative emotion. I decided to go with it in the sense that negative is something that brings you down rather than makes you feel worse rather than makes you feel better. Mm-hmm. But I don't have much to add to what your analysis of it. I think you're I really don't. You're exactly right. Is that all of our emotions are adaptive.
Right.
They're there for a reason, and we can choose to listen to them and use them as a guide to doing better in the future, or we can say, no, emotions aren't real data. I don't care what they say, which is a colossal mistake. But again, I think that there's a logic in just referring to emotions rather than positive emotions or negative emotions. I mean, you could say, I think there are emotions that make us feel bad and emotions that make us feel good. There's no question about that. But that's what.
Yeah, I think intrinsically, obviously, like being sad about crying sort of feels bad, but again, it's useful. It's good. There's
exactly
you need to do that in that circumstance, right?
Grief is an emotion.
Yes,
and
right.
So exactly. Why do we? Okay, so grief is an emotion. It's a very painful emotion. And so, do we want to eradicate it from the human condition? Do we want to like put everyone under, give everyone like put everyone under like some kind of CRISPR surgery so we can excise whatever set of genes that cause grief so that you will go through life and never experience grief again? I don't think so, because we grieve because we love. It's a reminder that we love, and so. Again, that's, it's painful, but it's not necessarily negative because it's adaptive.
Yeah. I want to go back to the no regrets thing. Is that because, and I made light of it a little bit there, but there are a lot of people that like either sort of try to abide by that theory or they tattoo it or whatever, like a bumper sticker or something like. Is that just complete bullshit as you say in the book? Like, is it just not even true, or is it? Because it certainly, I think, comes from a good place of like, hey, I want to try to learn from my mistakes and just move on and not dwell on the past, right? So is it misinterpreting that, or is it like, is there a serious problem with that motto? It's somewhere in between. And I don't want to put the onus on individuals, because essentially, especially in America, we have been fed this belief that the path to a good life is to be positive all the time, never be negative, to be happy all the time, not be unhappy, to always look forward and never look back. And I think what the weight of evidence tells us is that we are way better off being positive way more often than being negative. We're way better off being happier more than we are being sad. We are way better off looking forward than we are looking backward. But you want a little bit of feeling bad. You want a little bit of these emotions that make us feel worse, these negative emotions. You want some of those in your life because they're adaptive, because they're instructive. And so I think that people have been deluded into thinking that if they simply squelch that feeling of regret and don't talk about it and try to will themselves to be positive, that is going to lead them to a better life in the future. And that is wrong. What they should be doing is acknowledging that that painful emotion and saying, wow, wait a second, here's an emotion. It's coming in. Beep, beep, beep. It's making me feel worse. Uh-oh, that's a signal. What's it telling me? And using that information to say, what lesson is this teaching me, and how can I apply that lesson going forward? So I don't think it's like bad intent, these people. I just think that they've been sold a bill of goods about how to lead a good life. Is the whole premise though in the like, so I've heard Sam Harris kind of say something to this effect of like, but the whole idea of thinking you could have done something differently is bullshit to begin with. It's like, we have this notion that if we were able to wind the clock back, that we would have done something differently, or differently done it or not do it, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But that idea doesn't, even if you could do that, he sort of argues that you still would have done the exact same thing, because all of the circumstances, it's not like you would have the knowledge that you have now. You'd be in the exact same situation, like down to the atomic level. So everything would have unfolded exactly how it did. So is it just worthless to feel that way to begin with?
No, because I think that there's a way to, I think there's a way to deal with your regrets without falling into that kind of, almost like philosophy class trap.
Yeah, right. Okay.
You know what I mean? So,
yep, totally.
So you can say, on two different dimensions there. So one of them is when you scrutinize the decision, you should scrutinize the decision made by the person you were at that time, not the person you are today.
Yes.
Because the person you are today is a different person. We hope much better informed, much wiser than the person making that decision in the past. So you have to give yourself some grace and evaluate it based on the person who is there. The other thing is that life is so complicated that all of us make a whole set of decisions every single day, and in a weird way, those decisions, close a bunch of doors and open new ones in this kind of infinite infinite way. And so we don't, it could be that making that bad decision early in your life in some ways was actually the greatest thing that ever happened to you, because it led to a set of other doors and decisions that you wouldn't have otherwise gone through. I mean, I think that's interesting conceptually. I think that the way to think about it is to say that if you have an emotion that bugs you based on the decision you made in the past, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't stew and say, oh my God, my life would be so much better today if I had done that thing or hadn't done that thing. But basically say, wait a second, this decision or indecision I made in the past is really bugging me. That's telling me something. It's telling me something about what I value. It's telling me something about how I want to lead my life. And you should listen to that. It's like, it's a knock at the door. And I think you have to answer it. You can't hide under the couch. I don't think you can't barricade the door. I think you open the door and say, hey, what are you trying to tell me? And so I think about that. People think about this in their own I mean, life is so interesting, because it's like you make these decisions that seem to be insignificant that are actually transformative in your life. Yep. It's like you end up going, you go to the grocery store and you're in line, and then the person in line ends up being your spouse. And then because of that, you have these kids and these human beings who exist in the world because you happen to go to the grocery store at 3:00 that afternoon rather than at 5:00 that afternoon. I mean, that's kind of amazing, right? And so, so if you think about, I'll give you, this is not like a tortured, horrible mistake, but 100 years ago, I went to 100 years ago, I went to law school. I regret doing that. If I had it to do over again, I wouldn't go. Okay, I'm not beating myself up over that. It's not like I killed somebody or anything like that. It's not like a calamitous thing. But it turns out like it was one of that bad decision was one of the best things I did, because I met my wife in law school. Yeah. So if some sort of magical genie comes along and says, hey, Pink, I'm going to give you a bargain here. I'm going to allow you to go back in time. I'm going to allow you to undo that decision of going to law school. I don't know if I would take it. Yeah. Because I wouldn't have met my wife, and that wouldn't have led to all these other things. That said, I can still go back and look at it and say, you know what? That was a mistake. And the reason it was a mistake is because I was too risk averse. I was too concerned what other people what other people thought of me. I was too uninformed about the world. All right. Those are three things I want to know about myself. So I don't want to be risk averse. I don't want to be risk averse in the future. I don't want to care about what people think about me in the future. I do want to be more curious about how the world actually works rather than assume that I know what it is. So I can extract lessons from those that'll make me better in the future. And I don't necessarily need to concoct, elaborate scenarios about how much better my life would be had I not made that mistake. Right. I think that can be foolish.
Yeah. Is there like is there a line or a threshold people cross where they go from, like you said, everybody's got regrets. If they're honest, it's like it's not a no regrets scenario, right? Everyone's got stuff that they wish they'd done differently in whatever capacity. But where it becomes chronic, like a problem for people, right?
Yeah.
So I think of just an example of my own family. Like, I think my wife, I'm sure if I asked her, she's got regrets, but she doesn't dwell on any of that stuff. I never have gotten the sense that she's beating herself up over whatever from her past. Me, on the other hand, I had stuff, I would say, from my military experience that really bothered me for a very long time, like to the point of thinking about it every day, right?
Yeah.
That kind of a scenario. So is there something that makes that happen, so to speak? And then how do you have like a prescription that's the best way to get out of that? And I also am asking here I wanted to ask this idea of like, it's not really in the book, but like your thoughts on sort of PTSD, because that is sort of, I think that's part of the veteran experience. Like if you break down PTSD, a big piece of it can be, not necessarily, regret, right? It can be, hey,
Sure.
I should have saved this guy and I didn't. Or, I'm sure there's cases out there, we know about them, some historically, of like committing atrocities where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe what I did, right?
Yeah. So, what you're so I think there is a line that one crosses where what we're talking about becomes a medical problem.
Yeah. Right.
Whether you cross the border to an anxiety disorder, which is a medical problem, or, more horrifying, some kinds of PTSD. I think it can be there. And so why does this happen? I mean, I think that's still a mystery. I think at a broad level, what we know is that it's a combination of circumstance and your own physiology. There are people, you probably have, former colleagues who went through essentially the exact same experience.
Yes.
And one was wrecked by it and one was not.
Right.
And that probably has to do with the biology of person A versus person B. When it tips into that, it's like, that's when you call a doctor, because we have, there are therapies for PTSD,
right,
whether it's exposure or cognitive behavior therapy or things like that. There are other kinds of techniques especially for anxiety, for emotion regulation. So, but there is a line. There is a line where this becomes where wallowing is not a kind of a self-sabotaging thing you do, but is actually evidence of a medical problem.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I wish we could figure out a way to get ahead of, like further upstream on in terms of problem, right? Like risk factors or something where it's like, hey, just so you might be more prone to this, so you need to recognize it in your life, that kind of thing,
Yeah, that might exist. I can see that might exist. That could exist now. I mean, I think you could do a proxy for it if you look at people's families. But it wouldn't surprise me, Chris, if at some point we were able to do certain kinds of genetic testing that says, based on your genome, you have a higher probability than the median person for experiencing anxiety or something like that, and therefore you might want to take steps now. In the same way we have certain kinds of markers for things like heart disease. There are some markers for, say, early onset dementia. But again, these are all probabilities. There are relatively few things that are certainties, because it's way more complicated than that. It's way more. It's way more dynamic than that. But just think about, in a relatively short time in human history, we've gone from this world where we derided, say, veterans from World War I or World War II. Oh my God, that guy's weird. He's shell shocked.
Right. Yes.
And just look as like a weirdo or a weakness. And now we have the ideal combination, which is compassion from others, and also a way to analyze and treat it. And so that's in the space of 100 years, which in human lifetime is a blink of an eye. Right. So I think we are making progress on that. I think the same thing is true the way we're making progress on, just people experiencing just difficulties, even difficulties that metastasize to mental illnesses, people's willingness to talk about them, and the fact that we're not, this is in my own lifetime, it's the fact that we don't stigmatize them nearly as much as we did a little while ago.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the other sort of like quantitative tools or like, actual things that people can do? Because we sort of mentioned just talking to somebody about regrets is helpful. There's a cathartic kind of process there, writing it out. But I think of things too, like getting more specific on it. Actually, there's a process too. Andrew Huberman talks about this, where it's like, if your worst memories, so to speak, where you literally just write it out for like 15 minutes. And if you do that, do you know about this process?
Absolutely. No, this is built. I think I write about this very briefly in the book. This is built on the research of Jamie Pennebaker at the University of Texas. And what it shows us is that simply writing about this negative experience or regret for 15 minutes a day for 3 consecutive days can be very useful.
Yeah, right.
Simply that. Not necessarily. One needn't share it.
Right. And you don't have to do what I would consider kind of the next thing, which is like try to reframe it, right? Try to do but at least kind of
you could, but even that is valuable. And let's go at that a little. Let's click on that again and understand that, because I think it's a really important point. I think what happens, and this is what Pennebaker has done a lot of work on this. I think the mechanism here is really interesting and important to understand. When we feel bad, when we have these emotions, these feelings that make us feel bad, those emotions, those things are amorphous. They're like a vapor cloud. All right. And that's one of the reasons why it makes us feel bad. We're sort of enveloped in this vapor of unpleasantness. Mm-hmm. When we write about that or talk about it, it takes that thing that's abstract, and vaporous, and makes it concrete.
Right.
It makes it, and so those words, yes, exactly, and that concrete words are less menacing. There's something menacing about a cloud of vapor or a cloud of smoke, but when you take it and describe it and identify it and reify it, as you're saying, and and make it concrete, that's less menacing. This is one reason why there's a paradox here in some of the research, which shows that writing, not this is not gratitude exercise, but simply writing about a positive experience and trying to analyze it. All right. Let me write an analytic essay about why I love my wife. All right. Or let me write an analytic experience about why I felt joyous at that picnic. That can actually take the joy out of it.
Yeah, this is really interesting.
Because you have this, because these emotions are kind of vaporous. All right. And so when you have like a happy vapor, I'm just bathing in this, and so you don't want to make it concrete. But for these other things, you can take the menace away from it by making it concrete. And so that's something else that's very simple that's something else that's very simple that people can do.
Yeah, that was such a fascinating thing, that thing about positives. It's almost like if something is positive, whatever, uplifting, keep it internal, right?
Just go with it.
Don't externalize it.
Just go with it. Don't try to explain it. Don't try to analyze it. Enjoy it. Just go with it.
Yeah.
Just bask in it. It's like just go with that.
Right.
Remember it, put yourself back in situations like that, but don't try to, make it too concrete.
Yes.
Like, I really enjoyed this picnic because it was 79 degrees outside and I was sitting on this corner of the blanket rather than that corner of the blanket. It's like, oh my God, and so that's one. Another exercise that I like is, and I got this from Tina Seelig at Stanford, is a failure resume.
Yeah, this is the other one I was going to ask you about.
I like this, and I have a somewhat modified version of it than what I wrote about in the book, which is so failure. So everybody has resumes where they list all the great things they've done. Failure resume is to make a list of your failures, your setbacks, your screw ups, your mistakes, et cetera, et cetera. Make a list of those. And then in the next column, list what lesson you learned from it. And in the third column, list what you're going to do about it. I originally counsel people to do it for like their entirety of their life. I think that's a mistake. So I would say that's too.
That would
I
be-
did
I'd
it.
be- I'd still be writing like 3 hours later. I mean,
I did it, and I'm not joking around. I did it. And I'm like scrolling. It's like, like you get to the spreadsheet. And it's like 147. It's like holy,
yeah. Right.
And so pick 3 things. I think that can be really useful.
Okay.
And again, this. I mean, there is a like there's a reason the military does after action reports. I mean, that's essentially
Right. Yeah.
that's essentially what that is.
Yeah.
There's and so we just as a coincidence, just coincidentally. I mean, I did this. I just earlier today I did a little debrief on a project that I did that just didn't work all that well. It just didn't work. That's what happens. And so I did a kind of a quasi after action report where we sat down and looked at what was it about what we did, what was it about the moment we were in, what was it about the people we were with that this thing just didn't work. And it's super useful. It's super useful. I always want things to work rather than not work, but the big mistake is when something doesn't work, when things go south on you, and you just like ignore it and don't try to don't try to learn from it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that failure resume idea. I'd never heard that idea. And I was like, oh, that's a good one. I dig that.
Yeah, it's good. It's very useful to people. I mean, when I did it, and again, I did it too much. I don't recommend that. I like picked 3 or 4 or 5 things. Honestly, I think that was a bad idea what I did. And I think it was not a great recommendation to other people. I think you could do a smaller version of it. Yeah. But one of the things that was useful to me was that when I did this, and it was like in the second column, what lesson do you learn? Did it learn? Like I had two lessons kept coming up over and over and over again. And it's like, whoa, wait a second. Like that was, it was super useful to me because I think in many ways I've avoided those things in the future. But like the lesson that I derived from a lot of these mistakes and failures and setbacks were pretty important. And I was able to understand them better by having done that exercise.
What do we do as parents to try to make our kids better at dealing with regret? I mean, we started this off talking about our kids and like going off to college and graduating from college. So are there suggestions of ways we, impart this upon our children so that they're better equipped to deal with it?
Yeah. Yes. I think that the main thing that we can do is we can talk about our own regrets and our own mistakes, but do it in a certain way. Don't do it in a way that's cavalier. Don't do it in a way that's like kind of self-flagellating, but do it in a way that is, instructive, saying, here's a regret that I have. Here's a mistake that I made. Here's what I learned from it. And here's what I've decided to do about it in the future. I mean, just about every kid leans in. If you go to any, I don't want to say me or you, or I just want to say any parent. If a parent goes to their kid and says, I want to tell you a life lesson, the kids are going to be like, all right. You want to hear a life lesson? Kids are going to be running to the other room. But if you say, you want to hear about a time that I really screwed things up? Yeah. Every kid wants to hear that about their parents screwing things up. And so what it does is that it normalizes mistakes, it normalizes regret, and models a way to deal with it in a healthy and productive way. I think that's the most important thing. The other thing is also, to the extent that your kids want to talk about their mistakes or their regrets, that can be helpful too. And, and moving them much more toward, again, this third way of not ignoring these painful emotions and not stewing over them, but actually thinking about them, evaluating them. Yeah.
I also think just, from my own experiences, like apologizing in real time too, when you do screw something up, right? Like, I mean, I've had to do that with my own kids. Like, hey buddy, sorry, I screwed that up. I'm sorry about that. That was a mistake on my part. I think, that's just a lead by example as best you can type of idea.
I mean, again, this really isn't that hard.
No, it's
I mean,
not.
just the idea of, of leading by example, of being a good role model, but I mean, again, I find it amazing. When I talk to like bosses or executives and things like that, it's like how much they don't understand that people are really not listening to them, but that they are watching them like a hawk. Like they don't, it's like, and I think the same thing is true with kids. Like kids often don't really I think it's healthy. It's like, you should be skeptical about, especially as kids get older, you should be skeptical about your parents. Like you need to sort of, move away, form your own point of view, et cetera, et cetera. But I think parents overestimate how much their kids listen to them and underestimate how much their kids are watching what they do.
So last question here. If you mentioned the kind of the tattooing, the no regrets, and there's one about a Marine who then goes and gets it removed.
Yes.
And he's talking every time he goes in, he goes, I understand the irony here of me getting a no regrets tattoo removed from my arm, right?
Yeah.
So if someone were to replace that with like, a pithy encapsulation of your book, what would that be? Like, what would be a better tattoo? Approaching.
Great question. I want to try to keep this. I want to try to keep the tattoo as brief as possible.
Right. Yes.
Exactly. Rather than have like several paragraphs spilling across the arms. Think, learn, move forward.
Okay.
Small type. There's 4 words.
Small type.
But yeah. Think, learn, and think, learn, and move forward. I think I really think that's the most important. That's the most important thing about it.
Nice, cool. Obviously, you have a lot more books out there. If people want to connect with you, follow you, check you out, where do they?
You can go to my website, which is danielpink.com. There's got a newsletter. Like everyone else on the planet, I'm on social media. all kinds of great stuff there. danielpink.com.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. Really appreciate it, man.
All right. A pleasure.
Thanks for listening to On the X, the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation and an Ironclad original series sponsored by Mechanicswear. Learn more at NavySealFoundation.org or text On the X to 60104. See you next time.